Hi, this is Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Welcome to the weekly Top 3, the top 3 things on our mind here at Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets for the week of December 2nd, 2024. The weekly Top 3 is a regular segment on The Michael Dukes Show. The show broadcasts on both Facebook Live and YouTube Live, as well as via streaming audio from the show's website, weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. I join Michael weekly in the first hour of Tuesday's show from 6:10 to 7 a.m. for a discussion between the two of us about our 3 issues. We post the podcast of our discussion following the show on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, also on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets website, as well as the project's page on national blog site, medium.com. You can find past episodes of the weekly Top 3 also at the same locations. Keep in mind that in addition to these podcasts, during the week, you can also follow and participate in the discussion with us of these and other issues affecting Alaska's fiscal and economic condition by following us on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook page and through our posts on Twitter. This week, our top 3 issues are these. First, we discuss the outlook for the state's fiscal situation that likely will be reflected in the upcoming fall 10-year revenue forecast and budget plan. Second, in light of the likely severe fiscal restraints the state will be facing, we consider the outlook for the upcoming legislative session. And third, we explain why the recent sales pitch for the Alaska LNG Phase I project isn't very convincing and where we should be focused instead. And now, let's join Michael.
Well, we've got some stuff to talk about today, and man, there's a lot to unpack here because the election's been certified since then. We've seen some changing hearts and minds on Alaska LNG. We've seen all kinds of stuff. So let's get started this morning today with the brand new 10-year forecast as number 1 of the weekly Top 3. And I have a feeling that the pucker factor is about to be high. So, Brad, just hit us with what you got this morning.
It is going to be high, Michael. The 10-year forecast, for those of you who are now running to the governor's website or to the OMB website, it's not out yet. It's due out by December 15th. But we're in the period. The way they put the forecast together from the standpoint of oil prices is they look at a 10-day period. They average a 10-day period for the futures market somewhere along in here before December 15th. And that's the basis for the oil price. And we're in that 10-day period. So you can pretty well project, and the prices are staying fairly stable through this period. So you can pretty well project where the 10-year forecast is going to be. And it's not good, to say the least. Looking at the budget, as we've talked about it on the show, and as we talked about it in the last segment a couple of weeks ago, it's not even the FY25, even the budget we're in right now, is not looking good. Oil prices aren't living up to the projections that were made in the spring revenue forecast. They aren't living up to the projections on which the FY25 budget is based. And even though the FY25 budget was put together in a way that has some cushion, that is, they took a bunch out of the PFD to create an additional like $140 million or $150 million cushion that then they could spend in the supplemental. Even though they created that cushion in it, all the cushion's gone. And the projected prices now for FY25 were about 40% of the way through the year. So they're beginning to be a little bit firm. The projected prices for FY25 are going to come in. What we're going to see in the revenue forecast is they're going to come in fairly low. In fact, on the current trajectory, the baseline budget is built on $75 a barrel. The cushion was at $78 a barrel. So between 78 and 75, they built in that cushion. Current forecast, looking at the current futures market for the remainder of FY25, is about $73 a barrel, $2 a barrel below the baseline. And that, when you factor that in for projected volumes, that's about $110 million or so below the budget. So we're starting FY. We're going to this incoming legislature is going to hit Juneau with a forecast that's going to say even FY25 is underwater.
Right.
That they've got to find $110 million, either draw it from the CBR, which doesn't have much, or find adjustments that are going to offset that $110 million. That's day one. And that means there's no money for a supplemental. And so any supplementals they have to make is going to be an additional amount on top of that $110 million.
And that doesn't take into account any of the legislative priorities we're going to talk about in a bit, though, as well, which could account for millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah, and that's where we shift into looking forward at the 10-year forecast. And if you've got that chart, this would be a good time to throw that up.
You bet. The little one or the big one here. There we go.
The big one, the bigger one, the one that
the
one that has pictures as opposed to
one that has pictures. All right, here you go. There you go.
All right, thank you. So this looks at what the 10-year forecast is likely going to talk about or look like in terms of revenues and projected spending levels. And I've built this. This has FY25. FY25 is at the left end. FY33 is at the right end. That's the 10-year forecast, and then the average is the last bar on the right. And this looks at revenues versus spending. Spending is the total. Revenues are the bars inside the total. And then the top, which I'll talk about in a second, the top line is how much of the POMV draw you need to close the gap, to balance the budget, at least in terms of
Wait a second.
Right.
Wait a second. That number and that whole thing, that never drops below 82%, or 81%. What's the deal here?
Well,
spoiler alert, it's going to be bad.
Yeah, I'll get there in a second. But if you look at FY25 on the left-hand side, the dark blue is traditional revenues at the projected oil price levels that we now see out there, that they're going to be in the 10-day period. The gold or the yellow is the portion of the POMV draw that's designated for government. That is, under the statute, is set aside for government. The red is the amount of additional POMV draw you have to use if you don't have alternative revenues. The amount of the additional POMV draw, or put differently, the amount of the PFD cut you have to make to match the spending. Spending on the left-hand side is the FY25 number, and that is $5.53 billion. That's the amount appropriated for FY25 when they left the building, or when the governor signed the bill this summer. The FY26 and additional numbers are just FY25 adjusted by 2.5%. It's just to account for inflation. All those numbers are just increases of over the prior year of 2.5%. That doesn't account for any significant spending increases. That's just adjusting the current spending for inflation. And as you can see, what's going on is that the dark blue, the traditional revenues, are below because oil prices are below. The dark blue, the traditional revenues are below where they were forecast in the last 10-year forecast, and below where they were forecast in the spring revenue forecast. And that's creating an additional deficit. I mean, when you take the bottom out, which is essentially what traditional revenues are, when you take that bottom out, or when that bottom drops, something else has to fill the gap that's remaining. And what's filling the gaps is increased revenue, increased PFD cuts. And so between the gold and the red, between the portion of the POMV draw that's specified by statute for government, and the red, the additional portion of the POMV draw that has to be diverted to government, spending to close the gap, you're pulling now something like 80%. As Michael said, the bottom number is 81% across that time frame. The average is 84%. You're pulling 84. You're having to pull 84% of the POMV draw to government to balance the budget. Recall that the Senate has said their plan now, or their approach, is 25-75, 25% to the PFD, 75% to government. Well, that goes out the window, because you can't balance the budget if you don't have alternative revenues. You can't balance the budget on POMV 25-75. It's got to be even more than that. It's got to be POMV 84 averaged over the 10-year period, 84-16, in order to balance the budget through PFD cuts alone, the leftover PFD approach. So we're not facing a good outlook at all, even where we are, even at the FY25 budget, just adjusted for inflation going forward. We're at significant deficits that if you only use PFD cuts, take us well below POMV 25-75.
Right. No, I mean, we're literally at 17% of the POMV being used for the PFD. Instead of 50%, it's 17% for fiscal year 25. Now, my question on this, before we run out of time for this segment, on the futures and the 10-year forecast, I mean, does this take into account how bullish the president is on American energy and Alaska specifically? I mean, is that because, I mean, again, we could see oil drop even further as more oil comes to market, as more exploration happens, as the president unlocks and unleashes more of this stuff. 73 might not be the bottom.
Yeah, no, it doesn't take into account. It takes into account that drop as much as the futures market is taking that into account. So this is these numbers are following the futures market as it currently is during this 10-day forecast period. If the futures market is over projecting where oil prices are ultimately going to go as a result of additional production brought online, then this is over projecting. Where revenues are going to be.
Right.
And remember, yeah, we've talked about this on the show before, but remember that increased production isn't helping us. Within this 10-year forecast period, production is projected to go up by 35%. But state oil revenues go down over that period. So,
well, and there's nothing to say that as this goes forward, I mean, oil could get into the $60-something range, and then that just exacerbates this problem like you've never even seen as it goes forward. And again, this accounts for no new spending, no BSA increase, no defined benefits, no royalty subsidies for the gas or anything else. This is just straight inflationary money right here. And you could see that basically, the PFD continues to slip away. I'm just looking at this chart and realizing how boned we actually are. I mean, this doesn't account for any additional spending. I mean, you adjusted it for inflation, but I know that there's a factor in there as well. There's ratchet effects that are baked into the budget that is like $100 to $150 million a year, and escalators for employment contracts and all this other kind of stuff. You didn't include, this is just the raw inflationary increase.
This is just taking the prior year's budget times 0.25% or 2.5% times the current projection of inflation. Yeah, it's not factoring in any additional programs. It's not factoring in any additional spending or other.
Right.
So this is just inflation.
This is the rosiest projection, because this is inflation. If you add in another 150 million a year for the escalators, or I think Donna said, I think she agreed the other day that it was between 150 and 200 million, but let's just say 150 million a year every year on top of this. I mean, this is a 90% take of the POMV easily at that point, when you start talking about with no additional spending.
Yeah, I mean, what's really going on here, Michael, is the storyline I think that people ought to focus on is the bottom is dropping. The traditional revenues are dropping. What's really driving this story, what's really driving that top percentage number in this take, is that the bottom's dropping. And if if we have spending on top of that, spending increases at the same time that the bottom's dropping, the traditional revenues are dropping from where they were projected to be. Yeah, I mean, you sort of have unlimited unlimited percentages that start showing up in terms of take from the POMV or PFD cuts. So it's just, I mean, all of this, the entire campaign in the fall, we'll get into this in the next segment, but the entire campaign in the fall was based on, we're going to spend more. We're going to have more programs. I can out Trump your program, the lowercase version of Trump, not the uppercase version of Trump, but I could out Trump your program by, with my additional program. That's the entire campaign of the fall. And what's happened is the bottoms dropped out.
Yeah, no, it was a chicken in every pot deal. That's what it was. It was the chicken in every pot deal. Everybody, you get a chicken, no matter who pays, doesn't matter. Everybody gets a chicken, vote for me. That's what the whole thing was. But looking at those charts and looking at those numbers, I mean, I'm dramatically reminded of Sean Parnell's budget in 2013, 2014. When they based the whole budget on $115 a barrel and the bottom dropped out, it went down to like 72. And they're like, well, what do we do? And that's when, of course, when we spent, billions of dollars out of the CBR to balance the budget, because we just couldn't possibly think about actually cutting the state budget.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what happens at this point, Brad, other than the PFD gets completely eliminated. And then they come to you hat in hand to say, guess what? Pucker up, sugar lips. It's time. The free ride is over. It's time for you to pay your fair share.
Yeah, we've taxed middle and lower income Alaska families by taking away the PFD. We've cut the ability to live in Alaska for middle and lower income Alaska families by taking away the PFD. And now we're going to come to you and likely come with a regressive tax. I mean, top 20% is not going to want to pay. The oil companies aren't going to want to pay. Non-residents aren't going to want to pay. So, with a likely another regressive tax. People keep saying, well, I don't understand why people are leaving Alaska. Well, it's right here. I mean, you're taking away their ability to live, the economics of living in Alaska by focusing the tax, a heavy tax, because it's not broad-based, it's not spreading to everybody else, a heavy tax right on the very people who are leaving.
Yeah. All right, we're continuing with the weekly top three. Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, is our guest, and it is time for number 2 of the weekly top three, which is now that the election's been certified and we have kind of an idea of where the majorities are going, and we have all the campaign promises, and you get a chicken, and you get a chicken, and you get a chicken in your pot. Brad, what do you see? What's coming on?
Chaos. I mean,
chaos.
Well, let's look at it this way. The House is going to be in chaos anyway. I mean, if the House ends up at 21-19, which is 21 in the majority in this cobbled together majority, that they call a bipartisan majority, because Chuck Kopp and Louise Stutes are Republicans somehow. They call a bipartisan majority. They've cobbled it together, and it's only got 21. If the other Republicans hold together and they have 19, you've only got a bare majority in the first place. You've got a majority that is at the whim of any given member, almost at any time, and so it's not a real strong majority in the first place. You've got a governor who has exercised the veto pen, sometimes, not nearly often enough, but has exercised the veto pen sometimes. So you've got this majority put together who may be able to pass some stuff, pass it through the Senate, but then you got the governor who hopefully will veto it if it causes a substantial increased spending. So you've got chaos set up already. You don't have a stable majority in the House. You've got a majority in the Senate, but it can't do much alone without the House in terms of passing positive legislation. And you've got a governor sitting up there who still claims to be a conservative and who would push back on increased spending. So that's sort of the recipe for chaos at the very beginning. And then you add on, you layer on this budget or you layer on the 10-year forecast, and it's just going to increase the chaos even more. I mean, the entire fall, as we were saying during the break, the entire fall campaign was run on, I promise this increased spending, I promise this increased spending, I promise this increased spending, I promise increase K through 12, I promise increase defined benefits, I promise this, additional program, that additional program. And that sort of led up to an op-ed that was in the ADN this past couple of weeks by Bryce, Chuck Kopp, Louise Stutes, Neil Foster, Calvin Schrage, Andy Josephson, and Zach Fields, the leadership of the House coalition. The title of it is Alaskans Spoke, We're Listening and Acting. And it's just an outline of what they want to spend on. It's an outline of the increased spending that they say Alaskans voted for by electing them to the House. The problem is when they get there, there's not going to be the revenues to support it. And the revenues aren't there from the beginning. If you take POMV 2575 as the baseline, which is what a lot of these guys have said is the baseline. If you take POMV 2575 as the baseline, the revenues aren't there from the beginning for FY26. The FY26 revenues are the traditional revenues plus the portion of the POMV draws set aside by statute for government is 3.8 billion against a projected spending, just escalating FY25 spending for inflation of 5.67 billion. So you've got a 1.9 billion deficit against what the statute gives you in terms of revenue right at the beginning. $1.9 billion deficit, more than 30% of projected spending.
And that's with no increases in and of itself. That's just the standard spending right now.
That's just status quo budget plus an adjustment for inflation is a $1.9 billion deficit. So, they're coming down there thinking they have a mandate, and maybe they do because voters didn't anticipate the kind of revenue drop that we're seeing. They think they're coming down there with a mandate for increased BSA, for defined benefits, for other things that involve additional spending. They think they're coming down there with a mandate for that, but they got no revenues to pay for it within the constraints that they have. So, and nobody, I mean, sometimes I just don't understand. Nobody's talking about, alternative revenues. So they're leaving themselves, Chuck Kopp's out there talking about a balanced budget, which is the new code word for PFD cuts. Whenever you hear Chuck Kopp say balanced budget, or anybody in that majority say balanced budget, what they're really talking about is deeper and deeper PFD cuts, because that's the only way they've left themselves to balance the budget. So they're walking in the door with all these big aspirations in terms of spending, all these big commitments in terms of additional spending, with no revenue even to pay for the existing budget, with no revenue to pay for the existing budget adjusted for inflation, with all these commitments. It's chaos. And the governor, I mean, come on, Mike, you could do it. I know you could do it. The governor is set up, this revenue forecast is going to set the governor up to say, we can't afford it. Whatever you want to layer on, we can't afford it. You're going to have to either have to come up with alternative revenues, which you'll probably veto also. You're either going to have to come up with alternative revenues, or you're going to have to find spending cuts to offset the increased spending you want to do, which they can't do because everything's got a constituency, as we found out in 2019. So this session is set up for chaos. At the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of smoke, a lot of earnest discussion, a lot of earnest effort, a lot of we want to do this, but at the end of the day, they're not going to be able to do it because there just isn't going to be the revenues there to support it, or they're going to have to take PFD cuts to a whole new level that they haven't taken them before, and start rationalizing why they've now broken through 2575 and explain where the hell we're going next.
Well, and again, the one thing that you said early on in the election cycle is that, everybody, we need to ask the question of who pays, because that's not a question. I mean, yes, you're right. It was here. Everybody gets a chicken. Everybody gets a program. Everybody gets a spend, but nobody is talking about where the money's coming from. I mean, if you look at it as a percentile, and not to go back to number one too much here, but you were saying just in 2026, you're talking about a $3.8 billion in traditional revenues between the oil and the POMV draw and everything else. And that means a deficit of about $1.9 billion. But just as a percentage of the overall budget, that means that we are what? 38% deficit spending? I mean, 38% of our overall budget is deficit. I mean, that's madness.
Yeah, I think it's 33. If the numbers, I've got a chart that does that, so I can cheat on this sort of thing. But 33% in deficit, and think about this: the federal government runs about 25% deficits, 20 to 25% deficits, and so we've been closing those deficits through borrowing, running up the national debt. But even the federal government has deficits that sort of cap out between the 20 and 25% range. We're breaking into whole new territory with these deficits. And again, it's not that's even before increased spending. Those deficits aren't coming from increased spending. Those deficits are coming because the bottom's dropping, because because oil prices are dropping, and that's I mean that's just that's going to be huge. I think the average deficit over the 10-year period is like 30%. 30% is how much of the budget is in deficit, and if we don't have alternative revenues, how much is going to have to be drawn from the PFD. I've got another figure here. I've calculated what the PFD cut is as a percent of the statutory PFD. That is how much they're cutting into the statutory PFD in order to close these deficits. And the average over the 10-year period is 73%. So it's huge. I mean, just think about this. The numbers, the billions that we're talking about that's going to be transferred out of the pockets of middle and lower income Alaska families in terms of PFDs, the dollars that are going to be transferred out of their pockets over into government to help the government close the deficit that government's running are just huge. It totals up to something like $60 billion over the period. The transfer out of the pockets of middle and lower income Alaska families. Oh, that's not 60. It is about $20 billion. The amount that's going to be transferred out of the pockets of lower and middle income Alaska families over to government. And that's called a tax, Randy. I'm sorry.
Right.
But
Right.
Randy's gonna, blitz out now, but that's called a tax. The amount that's going to be transferred out of the pockets of middle and lower income Alaska families over to government is about $20 billion over the period. And people are going to say, oh no, God, we've got people leaving the state. We need to do something about it. We need to spend more for childcare. We need to spend more for this or that. We need to, build a whole bunch of new stuff to, have construction jobs. We need to, keep people here by spending more government money. Well, the only place that government money is coming from in the current revenue structure is out of the pockets of the very people who are leaving. And by spending more, building more, having more programs, you're taking more out of their pockets. And you're making the situation worse and worse and worse. You can see why we're in a death spiral. Because we're taking money out of the pockets of the very people that you're trying to keep. You're making their lives economically, you're making their lives worse.
So make me some predictions here based on the fact that we have this super thin majority in the House and this kind of, it's a Democratic, it's not even bipartisan. It's got 2 Republicans in it. The rest of them are Democrats, but they're going to try and say it's a bipartisan, I don't know, coalition or whatever. But so what do you think happens? Does this stuff get passed? Does somebody come to their senses and go, whoa, wait a second, we're already in deficits? What, you got any predictions for what we're going on?
It's going to be a blame game. and they're going to try to blame the governor. They're going to pass fiscally irresponsible legislation. They're going to pass legislation we can't afford. They're going to make the state's economic situation worse. They're going to make the economic situation of middle and lower income Alaska families, which they claim they're doing all this for. They're going to make their economic situation worse by deepening PFD cuts. They're going to pass all this, and they're going to say we fulfilled the mandate we had out of the fall election, and they're going to leave it to the governor to veto it, which hopefully he does. I mean, hopefully Mike has a spine, at least on this issue. Hopefully they're going to leave it to the governor to veto it, to bring it back to fiscal reality, and then they're going to blame him. They're going to say we tried to do all this, but in the end we couldn't do it because the governor's anti-kid, or the governor's anti-education, or the governor's
Right.
anti-public employee, or whatever the hell they're trying
Well,
to do.
this is where the messaging for the governor needs to be very clear. I mean, he needs to chart it out in a simple chart that says, here's where our spending is, here's where the revenues are, and here's why I vetoed it, because it would eliminate the PFD and institute taxes in X number of years.
If
That's what I mean. That put it one simple chart. Here's where it is. The X and the Y curve. There you go. This is why I vetoed it, because we can't afford it.
If the governor had a good communications group, or governor had a good strategy group, he would do that at the beginning. He would do that from the very start and say, we can't afford this. We have put ourselves in a position where we can't afford this, and we've taken too much already from the backs of middle and lower income Alaska families. We've taken too much already from the backs of the people that we're trying to retain to get where we are. We can't afford it anymore. So if you want to do this, legislature, if you want to go through and pass all this stuff, if you want to waste all your time doing that, do it. But we can't afford it. And if he really had a good messaging operation with him, he would say that from the very beginning, so that he doesn't get stuck at the end. After they pass all this stuff, doesn't get stuck at the end being the bad guy. He ought to be the adult in the room from the beginning.
Yeah.
Talking about this stuff.
Like I said, this is where it's key that he gets a good messaging campaign, which he's not been great at. It's unfortunate. He has not been good at. But if he puts one person in there that can create a simple chart and shows it up and say, this is what we're talking about, and this is why I vetoed it. It's not because I hate children and puppies. It's because we simply can't afford it. They've been talking in the chat room about, leaving the state, who's leaving the state, kids are leaving the state, all this other kind of stuff. I'm thinking about leaving the state. I mean, that's the problem, is that it gets to that point where people are like, I can't, it just doesn't make any sense. My dollar's not going any further. The inflation's hitting us. This is hitting us. That's hitting us. No more PFD, and maybe potentially new taxes. And the government has become the economic driver of the whole state.
Yeah. Well, it's, we have slowly worked our way into this mess. And the fall wasn't any better. I mean, the fall was, I can spend more than you can spend. Ben Carpenter's, we're going to look back on Ben Carpenter and think, oh, this guy really actually understood what was going on. I mean, Ben Carpenter has tried to create a link between the economy, the private economy, and the way government thinks about issues. He's tried to create a system that would lower the burden on middle and lower income Alaska families, on working Alaska families, on working age Alaska families. Proposed all that stuff, had it out there, but oh no, we couldn't do that. We couldn't do any of that. We just need to spend more. That's our solution. We just need to spend more. We need to spend more on K through 12. We need to spend more on our special interests. And so we've ended up in this situation where, we've made ourselves very, very, very dependent on the continuation of the baseline, the continuation of oil revenues, as one piece of continuing the direction that we're going. And with that falling out, with that baseline starting to fall off, with oil prices starting to drop off, you're seeing what that exposes. You're seeing that that we can't support the kind of spending levels that we've built up. Or if we do,
Well,
it's at the expense of the very people we're trying to retain, that we start
right.
taking more and more money out of their pockets.
Well, if we had a more of a traditional revenue model in the state as they had in every other state, there'd be no way that they could have a 30% deficit spend every year for the next 10 years moving forward, because the private economy wouldn't stand for it, because they would have to keep coming back to you instead of tapping into the PFD. I mean, it really truly is what Rob Myers and Ben Carpenter have been talking about, that disconnect between the public and the private economy. The private economy is just an afterthought. I mean, that's all it's become. I mean, really, this has become a governmental consumption engine. That's all the state of Alaska has become, is they are driving the economy with that government spend and the government employment and everything else. And the private economy is if anything an afterthought.
Yeah, they're doing it by sucking more and more. I mean, Michael, I can't overstate this enough. That's why I've restated it repeatedly, I guess. But they're doing it by sucking more and more and more out of the very people, out of the very segment they say they're prioritizing. They're doing this. They're building additional government spending. They're building additional government programs by taking more and more and more out of the pocket of working Alaska families, working age Alaska families, middle and lower income Alaska families, the people that are leaving. And they're drilling the hole that those people are that group is dealing with deeper and deeper and deeper, in order to fuel this additional growth. It's just it's sort of numbing after a while, because I repeat it so much, but it's sort of numbing after a while how stupid this is. We're creating programs that we say we need to have in order to keep middle and lower income, in order to keep working age Alaska families. We need all these programs to keep them, and we're doing it by taking money out of those very pockets, focusing the entire burden of government on that very segment and taking money out of their pockets. It is the most stupid fiscal system we've got going.
Well, and making it more inefficient, because we know when the money leaves the private sector and goes into government hands, it doesn't turn as much, right? It doesn't have that reinvestment kick that it normally has in the private sector. I mean, money turns 5, 6, 7 times in a private economy. It turns barely one if it's being spent by government, because it has built-in inefficiency. So you're taking monies from the people that you are purportedly trying to protect, and you're using it to spend it on them, but now it's being consumed in the process instead of just leaving it in their hands in the first place. It literally at the end ends up being about the control of it. We can control it.
Yeah. And that's all about to become worse, because when you look at what the 10-year forecast is going to tell us, when you look at what oil prices, what the futures market is telling us about oil prices, with oil prices going down, that's all going to become worse, because there is no other we've left ourselves with no other revenue source other than to dig the hole that we've put middle and lower income Alaska families into deeper and deeper and deeper.
All right, Brad, number 3, I had to laugh. I talked a little bit about this yesterday, because it seemed like the editorial board of the ADN has been listening to the show, because they were basically all of a sudden parroting all the things that I've been saying, you've been saying, that this emotional tie to Alaska gas is not a fiscally responsible plan, and that we have to admit that it's just not going to. I mean, it was shocking that, I was like, wow, it's like somebody recapped all of our shows over the last, 10 weeks or something and wrote an editorial. Is something finally coming around? What's the deal on AKLNG?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, the House Resources Committee held the old legislature, the legislature that's holding over until the new legislature comes in. The House Resources Committee from the old legislature held a hearing on Cook Inlet gas and on AKLNG. And it was, I think, for the purpose of letting them get their sales pitch out there, both of them, both those who still want to make adjustments to the or royalty relief or whatever they want to do in Cook Inlet, and those who want to, go forward with the AKLNG project, the new Phase I project. I think it was to let them make their sales pitch and to get that sales pitch out in front of out in front of the coming session and to sort of lay a baseline and a groundwork. If the purpose of that was to build a groundswell for either of those proposals, I think it backfired. The hearing itself didn't get much attention. The only article I saw on it in the local press was an article up in the Fairbanks News Miner that was sort of a regurgitation of the presentations at the hearing. There wasn't anything, at least that I saw, in the Empire, the Juneau Empire, or in the Anchorage Daily News, or even in the Alaska Beacon, which tends to report on this stuff. The hearing was just sort of a dud in terms of the public reception of it, in terms of the public rebroadcast of it, if you will. But even more than that, the substance of the presentations I thought was pretty thin. It seems like, I mean, just taking it from that hearing, it seems like those who've been pushing for Cook Inlet relief are just sort of, they're going to their fallback position now of, let's just help out Blue Crest. Let's just help out the Cosmopolitan project by giving them royalty relief and, shoveling money down their throats from loans from ADA and other things. That's the project we want to get off the ground. And most of it was spent on how do we make Blue Crest, how much government support can we possibly throw at them in order to make them economic. That seemed to be the pitch for the Cook Inlet. The AKLNG project, the pitch seemed to be how much government support, how many obvious subsidies and how many hidden subsidies do we have to throw at the AKLNG project in order for it to get a delivered price that looks somewhat like what we're going to say is the imported LNG price. And basically what they did was, and I've done this myself in presentations over time, what you do is you pick a price, and this is the price I've got to say is the price we're going to have. And then you just sort of back into how many subsidies do I have to throw at it? And how many good assumptions do I have to make to get to that price level to make it look good? And that sort of seemed to be the AKLNG pitch. The problem is that the world LNG market is running away from that. The world LNG market is going down. They picked a price point of about $13 or $11 or $12, somewhere in that range. They layered it on with as many subsidies as they needed to get to that price point, to get to the $12 price point, and said that's competitive with imported LNG. And so there's all these other great benefits of having constructed this project, having funneled a bunch of money out the door, basically to non-resident contractors. There's all these other benefits to having done that. And we're competitive with the price. So, pick us. Problem is the world LNG market, as we show in our Monday charts. We do a Monday chart that looks at the futures market for LNG. Problem is the world LNG market is dropping as additional gas supplies come on the market, and as additional LNG projects come on the market. The world LNG price is dropping, and so the price point they picked starts standing out like a sore thumb as not a competitive price point. So it was a pretty underwhelming, frankly, project. And the response to that. Even though the ADN didn't run an article on the hearing itself, the ADN ran an editorial this weekend talking about the project, and the headline, as you noted, is "Time's up for Alaska natural gas pipe dreams." It's time to give up on LNG. Time to package it up. There is one sentence, Michael, that you probably picked up on yesterday, but I picked up on. It was, yes, we need to close it down, and yes, we need to stop the spending. But it's not so we can save. It's not so we can balance the budget.
So we can spend it on other things. Yeah,
exactly. The next to last sentence was the small but meaningful sum saved could be put toward many other state services that find themselves short on funding. So yeah, we got this budget that shows these huge deficits. But by gosh, we don't want to back off on spending on anything, even this thing we don't need. We don't want to back off spending on that. We want to spend it on something else. The other article. Tim Bradner did an article in the Frontiersman which I really liked. The headline of it is "Grab Your Pocketbooks, Energy Costs Will Rise," and it's talking about, even with AKLNG, that energy costs, gas costs, are going to go up significantly. And Tim, at the end of the article, Tim had something that I think probably it certainly is correct from a factual standpoint, but probably as people realize this, will put the final nail in the coffin of this proposal. A slimmed down version of this involving only the pipeline from the slope and delaying the LNG plant would still cost 10 to 14 billion. This is beyond the ability of consumers in the interior and south central Alaska to pay. However, the only alternative is for the state to provide the funding, and the state's only realistic source of funds is the Alaska Permanent Fund. So as you strip these layers of the onion away, and as you get down to the core of, okay, let's say we wanted to go forward with this, where's the dollars going to come from? Then 10 to 14 billion dollars, assuming you could actually find public debt at a cost that the project could afford, you'd really only need to come up with about $2.5 to $3 billion of that in terms of equity. The rest of it could be financed by debt. The problem with that, though, frankly, is that the debt cost that they've assumed to get to this $12 delivered price is below market. So you'd probably have to subsidize the debt too. And so we're talking about, just a big transfer from the permanent fund. And I think that's the point at which people will rebel. They'll say, oh no, you're asking for too much when you ask for transferring dollars from the permanent fund into this project, into this highly risky project. You're asking for too much. One other note on the highly risky part: when you look at, and this is the thing that really, I think should trouble people a lot, whether it will or not. When you look at declining LNG prices, declining global LNG prices, this thing could end up, the pipeline could end up being a white elephant for Alaska. We could spend all this money on it. We could build it, get to the $12 price point, and then find that the world market for LNG is $6. And so we've got, what we've done is we spent $10 billion to get us an uneconomic energy cost.
Right.
And then
that only we are using, and we're paying more than market value than if we just imported the gas in and of itself. It's painful. It's painful to watch. We've been talking about this for a while. We've got to divorce the emotion on this deal, and we need to get cracking on the importation of LNG. And there's a variety of ways you can do that, but it's crazy stuff. At this point, even if we got started today on the importation of LNG, we're still talking about 4 years, 5 years to get everything stood up in importing it, or is that a shorter road? Because I know they said if they started a pipeline, it wouldn't be the shortest. It would be 2031.
Yeah.
So
it's shorter for imported LNG. It's the only kit that you either require a rehab of the Kenai LNG plant, the existing Kenai LNG plant, or you require some work to create a dock for a floating gas for a floating LNG facility where you can regasify the gas, import and regasify the gas.
Point Mac or someplace,
yeah. And that is shorter time frame. I mean, you've got some permits that you've got to go through for both of those, which may take some time. But in the Trump administration, probably a shorter time period, and hopefully, done well so they withstand court attack. But you've got to go through some permitting, but it's a shorter time period. The floating LNG, or the LNG project, sort of matches up well, if we start it now, matches up well with the point at which Cook Inlet production declines to the point that we need additional supply. And the floating LNG timeline matches up well with that. Another problem with the AKLNG project is it's about 3 or 4 or 5 years too late to that point. So what the hell do you do in the meantime?
Yeah.
And that's why people, frankly, are so focused on Cosmopolitan, because they think that's the answer in the meantime from the Cook Inlet standpoint. But it may not be either, because it's got to have a bunch of permits also, and a bunch of investment to go forward. So it's floating LNG. I mean, the reason that the utilities are now sort of resigned to and talking about floating LNG or the LNG imports, is because that's about the only thing that's going to match the time frame in which we're operating.
Yeah, I mean, that's the difficult thing because we're projected to start to see that drop in what, 27, something like that. Yeah. So it's we've only got a couple 3 years to get it all together. And whether we put it down in at the Marathon plant in Nikiski or whether we put it on a floating platform on Point Mac or whatever, it's got to be it's something's got to happen.
But that's going to add to the chaos. That's going to add to the chaos in the legislature as well, because we have at least the new representative from the North Slope, who's going to be co-chair of House Resources, has said, we need that pipeline. What we need to do is to do the AK LNG project, and so they're going to spend part of the session, part of their time, trying to justify going after that pipeline. And Representative Dybert, who's from Fairbanks, and would like to be able to say that they're bringing North Slope gas down to Fairbanks through a pipeline, is the other co-chair, and she's likely going to be part of that as well. So they're going to burn time, add to the chaos of going down the track of trying to sell that program when it's unsellable. And
right.
And the administration, Dunleavy's out there saying that's Dunleavy's spend, right? The Democrats want to spend on K through 12, and they want to spend on defined benefits. Dunleavy wants to spend on energy, on pipelines, and on royalty relief for the Cook Inlet. And the Dunleavy administration is pushing the pipeline. So, it's going to add to the chaos of this coming session we don't have money to spend, but hey, we all want to spend it on different things. So let's just all spend it on everything. And
this is the modus operandi of the legislature. Just, the hard questions and just kick the can down the road. Just sit there and spin and study it and look at it and talk about it and debate it, and then adjourn and then come back the next year and do the same thing. This is exactly what they've done for decades in this state.
Yeah. And the foolishness of that will be revealed, I think, by the 10-year plan, as the bottom drops out of the oil revenues. The foolishness of saying, we can do all this stuff, we can spend it on all this stuff, we can have these big capital budgets, we can do the $10 billion. It's just all the foolishness of that's just going to be overwhelming.
I mean, how long until we're faced with this, though, Brad? How long until it's so obvious to everybody that even those who are in the legislature have to go, we can't. I mean, is it inevitable, or do we have to get these people out? I mean, do they just live in their own little bubble, or does it inevitably come up and slap them like a dead fish in the face?
Oh, they do live in their own little bubble. That's for damn sure. And they'll try to, the real interesting thing to me, as I look forward, is how they're going to try to rationalize moving away from 2575. How they're going to try to rationalize moving away from POMB 2575, because they're going to have to do that. Even to balance this year's budget, they're going to the FY25 budget. They're going to have to, think about doing that, and they're certainly going to have to do it as they think about FY26 and 27 and beyond. And I don't know, they're going to try to they'll try to rationalize it, and they'll try to keep going. But we're going downhill fast in terms of revenues.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch. Brad Keithley, anything else? What are we looking at for this next week? What are you watching?
Oh, we're probably 2 weeks out. We're probably not going to get the 10-year forecast and the budget this week, so it'll probably be next week. But I'll be focused on getting ready for that, I suppose.
I suppose. He sounds so excited about it. I suppose you've already gotten the sneak peek, and now you're like, oh, this is going to be so painful. It'll be interesting to see how they spin it compared to what you've got up there, and to see what the forecast, how truthful are they going to be? How optimistic are they going to be? Because that'll tell us something too, right there. If they get into that whole Sean Parnell 115 versus $73 a barrel kind of scenario, we'll know exactly where things are going.
Well, this is the governor's chance to spin, so he better start from the beginning, or else he's going to be behind the eight ball the entire way through.
Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you next week.
Well, that's a wrap for another week's edition of the weekly top 3 from Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Thank you again for joining us. Remember that you can find past episodes on our YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages. And keep track of us during the week on Facebook and Twitter. This has been Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. We look forward to you joining us again next week on the Weekly Top 3.